I was lying on the cold floor of my kitchen for 47 minutes before anyone found me. I know it was 47 minutes because the clock on the microwave was the only thing I could see from where I had fallen, and I watched every single one of those minutes pass the way you watch things when you are not sure what comes next. The linoleum was hard against my hip. My left leg was folded at an angle that told me something was very wrong. The pain was the kind that doesn't scream at you. It just sits there deep and certain, like it has already made itself at home and has no intention of leaving. I had tripped on the edge of the rug in the kitchen doorway, the same rug that had been there for 11 years, the same rug my wife Margaret had picked out from a catalog one Sunday afternoon, holding it up to the window to see the colors in natural light. I had tripped on it before. I always meant to tape down the corner. I never did. Margaret had been gone for 2 years by then, and I had been living alone in that house, with that rug and that corner, and all those small unfinished things that accumulate in a life that used to have 2 people in it, and now only has 1. My name is Gerald Haynes. I am 71 years old, and what I'm about to tell you is the story of the worst night of my life, and what I learned from it, and what I did about it, starting from the floor of my kitchen, looking at a microwave clock, wondering if my son was going to answer his phone. I should tell you about my son before I tell you the rest, because nothing that happened makes sense without understanding who Daniel is. Or who he became, I should say. Because the boy I raised and the man he turned into are 2 different people, and I have spent a lot of time trying to figure out exactly where the distance between them opened up. Daniel is 43 years old. He lives 22 minutes from my house. I know the drive exactly because I made it so many times over the years. Birthday dinners, holidays, the occasional Sunday when I would show up with something from the garden or an excuse I had manufactured because I wanted to see my grandchildren and didn't want to seem like I was imposing. He is an account manager at an insurance firm. He has a nice house, a lease car that gets upgraded every 3 years, and a wife named Brenda, who is pleasant in the careful, surface-level way of someone who has decided to be polite without being warm. They have 2 children, Tyler, who is 14, and Lily, who is 10. I love those children more than I have words for. I used to see them regularly. Then regularly became occasionally. Then occasionally became holidays. And then holidays became the kind of holidays where you sit at a table and feel the minutes passing. I don't know exactly when Daniel started seeing me as a burden. I have tried to identify the moment, the way you try to find where a crack in a wall first started. Was it after Margaret died and the grief made me call too often? Was it when I had the knee surgery and needed a ride to physical therapy 3 times a week for 6 weeks? Was it when I asked him once, just once, to help me understand a letter from Medicare that was written in language designed specifically to confuse people? I don't know. Maybe there was no single moment. Maybe it accumulated slowly, the way sediment does, until one day he looked at me and saw not his father, but an obligation, a weight, a problem that was only going to get heavier. I noticed it before the fall. I want to be honest about that. I noticed the shortened phone calls, the rescheduled dinners, the way Brenda would check her watch when I was mid-sentence at Thanksgiving. I noticed, and I told myself I was being sensitive, told myself that people get busy, told myself that this was just how adult children were sometimes, and it didn't mean anything, and I should not make a fuss. I was very good at telling myself not to make a fuss. Margaret used to say that was my greatest flaw. Gerald, she would say, you let things go so long that by the time you say something, you've already been hurt 100 times. She was right about most things. She was right about that. The night of the fall, I called Daniel first. I had managed to drag myself a few feet across the kitchen floor to where my phone had slid when I went down. My hands were shaking, not from fear exactly, more from the effort and the shock and particular helplessness of lying on your own kitchen floor at 9:30 at night, unable to get up. I called Daniel. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again. Same thing. I texted. Dad fell. Can't get up. Think something is wrong with my leg. Please call. I watched the screen. The little icon showed the message had been delivered. I waited. The microwave clock moved from 9:34 to 9:41. I called a 3rd time. He answered on the 3rd ring, and I could hear a television in the background and the particular acoustic of a comfortable room. Dad, it's kind of late. I told him I had fallen. I told him I couldn't get up. I told him I thought my hip might be broken. There was a pause. Not a long one, but the kind that contains a decision being made. Have you tried calling 911? I said I had called him first because he was my son and he was 22 minutes away. Another pause. Dad, that's what 911 is for. I've got the kids in bed and Brenda's not feeling well. Call an ambulance. They'll take care of you. I want to tell you how that felt, but I'm not sure I have the right words for it. It wasn't like being stabbed. It was quieter than that. It was more like watching a door close that you thought was always going to be open. I called 911. They were there in 11 minutes. Professional, kind, efficient, the kind of competent strangers who restore my faith in people even as my son had just done the opposite. They got me onto a stretcher, got me into the ambulance, talked to me in calm, steady voices while I looked up at the ambulance ceiling and thought about the microwave clock and the 47 minutes and the rug corner I never taped down. Daniel arrived at the emergency room 40 minutes after I did, not 22 minutes. 40. He had stopped somewhere. I never asked where, and I never will. And he came in wearing a jacket over a t-shirt, looking like a man who had been interrupted from something he would rather have been doing. He stood at the end of the hospital bed while the doctor explained that I had fractured my hip, that I would need surgery. That recovery for a man my age would take months and would require significant support and rehabilitation. I watched Daniel's face while the doctor talked. I watched the calculations happening behind his eyes. When the doctor left, Daniel stood there for a moment, and then he said the words that I have thought about every single day since. Dad, I love you, but you can't keep doing this. You're a troublesome old man, and I have a family to take care of. I can't be running to the ER every time something happens. You need to think seriously about a facility. He said it without anger. That's the part that still gets me sometimes. He wasn't cruel about it. He was practical, matter of fact, like he was discussing a logistical problem that needed an efficient solution. I looked at my son, my boy who I had taught to ride a bike, who I had driven to soccer practice for 6 years, who I had sat with through a broken heart at 17, and a failed exam at 20, and a job loss at 31. And I said nothing. I just looked at him. He left 20 minutes later, said he had to get back, said he would call tomorrow. He did not hold my hand. He did not ask if I was scared. He straightened his jacket, touched my arm once, briefly, the way you touch something you are already mentally categorizing as someone else's problem, and he walked out. A nurse named Patricia came in an hour later to check my vitals and found me staring at the ceiling. She was a small woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a no-nonsense manner that softened when she saw my face. "Is there someone we should call?" she asked. "No," I said. "There's no one." She put her hand on mine for just a moment. Then she went back to work. And I lay there in the emergency room in particular silence that settles over you when you understand that a chapter of your life has just ended, and you are the only one who knows it yet. I had the surgery the next morning. I will not spend too much time on the surgery itself, because the details are medical and not the point. The point is that I lay in a hospital bed for 5 days, and in those 5 days, alone with my thoughts in a window that looked out onto a parking garage, I did something I had never done before in 71 years of life. I got completely honest with myself. Not the surface honesty that most of us manage. The everyday accounting of what we did and whether we were good people. I mean the deeper kind. The kind where you go all the way down to the foundation and look at what is actually there. I looked at my relationship with Daniel, and I stopped making excuses for him. I stopped telling myself he was busy, he was stressed, he had a lot on his plate. I looked at the pattern of the last several years, the shortened calls, the rescheduled visits, the way I had shrunk myself down to take up less space in his life, so as not to be difficult, and I named it for what it was. My son had decided I was a burden, and I had cooperated with that decision by accepting it. I thought about Margaret, about what she would have said if she had been there to see that hospital room. I knew exactly what she would have said. She would have said, "Gerald Raymond Haynes, stop feeling sorry for yourself and decide what you're going to do." On the second day, I asked Patricia if she could bring me a notepad and a pen. She brought me one without asking why. I started writing. Not angry writing. Not a list of grievances. Just clear, honest thinking on paper about my life. What it looked like right now, what I wanted it to look like, what was standing between those two things, and what I had the power to change. By the end of day 3, I had 4 pages. By the end of day 5, I had something more valuable than 4 pages. I had a decision. The decision was this. I was done being a troublesome old man. Not because Daniel had called me one, but because I was going to stop being the version of myself that had allowed that label to stick. I was going to stop waiting for my son to show up. I was going to stop measuring my worth by whether he called. I was going to stop making myself smaller to fit into a space he had already decided was too small for me. And I was going to take back control of my life, my finances, my future, my relationships, my joy. In a way, I had let slide in the years since Margaret died. In a way, I had let slide, if I was honest. Even before that, I had resources Daniel didn't fully understand. I had a life that had more in it than he had bothered to notice. And I had time, not unlimited time. I was 71 with a healing hip. I was not naive about time, but enough to do this right. On the morning of day 5, before the discharge paperwork was ready, I made 3 phone calls. The first call was to a man named Robert Tillis. Robert had been my financial advisor for 19 years. He was meticulous and careful and had a long memory, which is exactly what you want in a financial advisor. He also knew things about my finances that Daniel did not. Specifically, that the life my son thought he understood was considerably more substantial than the impression I had allowed him to form. Margaret and I had lived modestly. That was a choice, not a necessity. We drove sensible cars and took reasonable vacations and shopped sales and cooked most of our own meals, and people who saw our life from the outside, including our son, made certain assumptions. Those assumptions were wrong. Margaret's father had been a careful investor. When he died, he left Margaret a portfolio that she managed quietly and well for 30 years, reinvesting, compounding, never spending lavishly because that was not who we were. When Margaret died and left everything to me, I continued in the same way, living on my pension and Social Security, leaving the portfolio untouched, adding to it when I could. Daniel knew about Margaret's inheritance in the vague way that adult children know things they haven't paid close attention to. He knew there was money. He didn't know how much. He had never asked directly, and I had never volunteered specifics, and so the number in his head was probably a fraction of the reality. I told Robert the first wanted to review everything. I told him I was making some changes. He asked if I was all right. I said I was better than I'd been in a while, which was true in the ways that mattered. The second call was to a lawyer named James Whitfield, who had handled Margaret's estate and who I had kept an occasional contact with since. I told him I wanted to update my will and my estate documents. Completely, starting from the beginning. He said he could see me the following week. I said I would be there. The third call was to my neighbor, a woman named Diane Pierce who was 68 and had been widowed 3 years before me and had, in the time since Margaret died, become something I hadn't expected and hadn't been looking for, a genuine friend. She brought soup when I had a cold. I fixed her fence when a storm took part of it down. We had coffee on Tuesday mornings and argued about books and watched old films on Friday evenings and never made it into anything more complicated than what it was, which was 2 people who had each lost their person and had found, carefully and without pressure, that the world was less lonely with someone in it. Diane answered on the first ring. I told her what had happened, all of it, including the things I hadn't told anyone. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I value most about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Gerald, when do they discharge you?" I said, "Tomorrow morning." She said, "I'll be there at 9. She was there at 8:45, which is exactly the kind of person Diane is. I came home to a house that she had quietly, without being asked, made ready. The rug in the kitchen doorway was gone, removed and replaced with a clean mat with non-slip backing. The bathroom had a new grab bar beside the tub. The front steps had a temporary railing that her son-in-law had come by to install the previous evening. The refrigerator had food in it. I stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at all of this and felt something shift in my chest that was not grief, exactly, but was related to it. The feeling of being seen by someone who chose to see you. Daniel called that afternoon. Brief, checking in, the voice of a man fulfilling an obligation. He asked how I was, mentioned that we should talk about next steps at some point, used the word facilities, again in the careful way of someone who has already reached a conclusion and is looking for agreement. I told him I was fine. I told him I was handling things. I told him we would talk soon. I did not tell him what I had decided. Not yet. People who underestimate you are most accountable for that mistake when they discover it on their own. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. I want to be honest about that, because the truth of rebuilding a life is that it happens in small, steady steps, not in grand gestures. I work with my physical therapist, a young man named Andre who was relentlessly encouraging and quietly demanding in exactly the right proportions. I walked, I rested, I walked further. I came back to myself physically in the slow, honest way that recovery actually works. I met with James Whitfield, and I went through my estate documents line by line. The new will was thorough and considered and reflected the reality of my life as it actually was, not as it had been organized around assumptions that no longer held. I made provisions for Diane, who didn't know and would not know until the time came. I set up a trust for Tyler and Lily, my grandchildren, who had done nothing wrong and whom I loved completely, structured so that they would receive it directly when they came of age, not through their father's hands. I adjusted what Daniel would receive, not eliminated. He was still my son, and I was not interested in punishment for its own sake, but adjusted, significantly, in ways that accounted for the reality of our relationship, rather than the version of it I had been maintaining out of hope and habit. I called my granddaughter Lily on her birthday in March, and when Brenda answered and said Lily was busy, I said that was all right and asked her to tell Lily that Grandpa called and that I loved her. 2 hours later, Lily called me back on her own little phone, and we talked for 45 minutes about her science project and a book she was reading and a disagreement she'd had with her best friend, and I sat on my porch in the afternoon sun and thought, this is what matters. I joined a woodworking class at the community center that I had been thinking about for 3 years and never started because I was always waiting for the right time. The right time turned out to be a Tuesday in April, with a hip that still ached in cold weather and hands that hadn't held a chisel since my 30s. I was terrible at it. I loved it immediately. Daniel found out about the estate changes in June, not because I told him directly. James Whitfield had sent some updated documentation that required Daniel's signature in his capacity as the original named executor, a role I had also changed. Daniel called me on a Wednesday evening, and this time it was not a brief checking-in call. His voice had a different quality to it, tight, careful, working to stay measured. He asked if we could meet. I said, of course. He came to the house that Saturday. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had eaten breakfast for 30 years, the same table where Margaret and I had helped him with homework, where we had celebrated his college acceptance, where we had sat the night Brenda went into labor with Tyler, and he talked around what he wanted to say for several minutes before he said it. He said he was concerned. He said he'd been blindsided. He said he didn't understand why I had made changes without talking to him first. He said, and this is the part one want you to hear clearly, that he had always planned to take care of me, that he thought about my future all the time, that the things he had said at the hospital had come out wrong, that he was stressed, that he hadn't meant it the way it sounded. I let him finish. I poured us both coffee. I sat down across from my son, and I looked at him, really looked at him, the way I hadn't let myself look in a long time, because the looking was too painful. And then I said, quietly, the things I had written on those 4 pages in the hospital. I told him I knew he loved me in whatever way he was capable of at this point in his life. I told him I was not angry. I told him that I had spent several years trying to be easier for him, smaller, less present, less troublesome, and that it had cost me something I was only now beginning to get back. I told him that what he had said in the hospital had not come out wrong. I told him it had come out honestly, maybe for the first time in years, and that the honest version of how he saw me was something I needed to hear, because it freed me from waiting for something that was not coming. I told him I was not going to a facility. I told him I had a good life, and a good friend in Diane, and grandchildren I intended to know fully, and a woodworking class on Tuesdays, and more financial security than he'd realized, and that I intended to live the rest of my life in exactly the way that made sense to me without adjusting it to fit his comfort. I told him the door was open. I told him I would always be his father, and I would always love him, and that would not change. But I told him that the version of our relationship where I diminished myself so he could feel unburdened was over, and if he wanted a relationship with me going forward, it would be between two people who were honest with each other. He didn't say much after that. He sat with his coffee. He looked at the table for a while. When he left, he hugged me at the door, a real hug, not the arm touch from the hospital, and I let myself feel that without reading too much into it. Whether he comes back, really comes back, in the way that would make the relationship worth having, I don't know. That is his choice, and it is not mine to make for him. I have stopped making things easier for people at the cost of myself. Even my son. It is autumn now as I tell you this. The leaves outside my kitchen window are doing what they always do, which is be beautiful in a way that you can't quite prepare for even when you know it's coming. My hip is 90%, which Andre tells me is as good as it's going to get, and which I've decided is more than enough. I finished a small wooden box in woodworking class last month. Crooked in one corner, slightly uneven on the lid, the most imperfect thing I've made with my hands in decades, and I am unreasonably proud of it. It sits on my kitchen counter next to the coffee maker. Diane and I drove up to see the fall foliage last weekend, a 4-hour trip that we had been talking about for 2 years. We stopped at a diner for pie and argued about whether apple or pecan was superior with the comfortable intensity of people who have earned the right to disagree about small things. She is one of the best people I know, and I am grateful for her every single day. Tyler, my grandson, called me out of the blue 2 weeks ago to ask my advice about something. A disagreement with a friend. The kind of tangled 14-year-old social situation that feels enormous from the inside. I don't know how he got the idea to call me. Maybe Lily told him I was a good listener. We talked for an hour. At the end, he said, "Thanks, Grandpa. You're actually pretty smart." I told him I had my moments. I think about the floor of my kitchen sometimes. The 47 minutes. The microwave clock. The rug corner I never taped down. That, in the end, turned out to be the thing that started all of this. I think about Patricia the nurse with her reading glasses on the beaded chain, who held my hand for a moment when I needed it, who I never got to properly thank. I think about what Daniel called me. Troublesome old man. And I think, yes, I suppose I am. Troublesome enough to refuse to disappear on someone else's schedule. Troublesome enough to take up space, to have opinions, to fill a room instead of shrinking out of it. Troublesome enough to still be building things, still making friends, still taking drives to see leaves turn colors, still arguing about pie. Troublesome enough to be fully, stubbornly, completely alive. I was lying on the cold floor of my kitchen for 47 minutes. And when I got up, not that night, but eventually in all the ways that matter, I got up different. I got up as myself. If you're still here with me at the end of this story, I want to say something directly to you. Maybe you know a Gerald. Maybe you are a Gerald. Someone who's been made to feel like too much, like a burden, like a problem to be managed instead of a person to be loved. Maybe you've been doing what I did for years, making yourself smaller, quieter, less troublesome, waiting for someone to finally see you without asking to be seen. This is your sign to stop waiting. You don't need permission to take up space. You don't need someone else to recognize your value before you act like you have it. The rebuilding can start from a hospital bed, from a kitchen floor, from wherever you are right now, looking at whatever clock is in front of you. This channel, The Midnight Confession, exists for stories like Gerald's, the ones that don't make the news, the ones that happen in hospital rooms and kitchen tables, and long drives through autumn leaves, the ones about ordinary people who hit the floor and decided, quietly and without fanfare, to get back up differently. If that speaks to you, subscribe right now, because every week I sit down and I tell you another one, and some of them will make you angry, and some will make you cry, and some will make you want to call someone you love and tell them while you still can, and every single one of them is worth staying for. I'll see you at midnight.